Well, hello everyone, and my name is Pamela Noury. I am one of the senior expedition leaders for Noble Caledonia, and we have with us on this interview, calling from Canada, is Jane Wilson. Now, Jane here, she has been working at Noble for, in fact, I think my very first cruise 12 years ago, when I was a little rookie, wet behind the ears, Jane was the expedition leader, so she's been EL for a long, long time. And she was also based in Macquarie, which is the Australian sub-Antarctic island, as the field biologist doing penguins and seabirds. So we're very, very lucky to count Jane with all her experience as part of the Noble team. And also, she leads many of our expeditions down to the Antarctic, which is what we wanted to talk to you about today. Hey, Jane.
Hi, Pam. How you doing?
Yeah, good. I mean, you and I, we do the expedition types of cruises. We're not doing too much of the destination stuff. And as far as the expedition goes, which we define as when we use zodiacs, Antarctic is probably the ultimate expedition destination.
Absolutely. And of course, what an expedition cruise is all about is being on a small ship where you can have maximum flexibility with our Zodiac craft to take advantage of weather or wildlife. And of course, Antarctica is the most remote destination for expedition cruising. And so it really is the ultimate as far as the expedition experience goes.
Yeah, and it just brings in all those ideas that you really need to be flexible and take advantage of things at the last minute. There's no docking, everything happens by Zodiac. So it's quite intrepid, and I think that's where expedition cruising more or less began.
Exactly, it's the heart and soul. It began in 1970 and it's gone from strength to strength. And the good thing about Noble Caledonia, they've stuck with the most successful formula, and that's of course a relatively small number of guests. So we've got always 100 or less, and that means we can manage things easily ashore. It means guests get the maximum time and the best experience because we can change plans pretty quickly with that number of guests on board.
Yeah, that's right. And what, Jane, you're talking about is we are members of IATO, which is the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators. And almost all the operators down there are members. And one of the rules that we all came up with a long time ago is not to have more than 100 people ashore at any one time. And so the crux being that we have 100 passenger vessels, which we're one of the few left at the moment with these small ships, is that we can have everyone ashore at the same time for the whole morning. We don't have to do rotations and things like that, which is really a bonus.
Absolutely. And the experience, as you say, is intrepid. It's rugged. The weather can be wild and woolly, and it really is something special. We rarely see other people. We might pass another ship at some stage, and occasionally we might visit a scientific research station, but we're pretty well on our own, and it's all about us squeezing the most out of whatever happens down there, whether it's wildlife experiences, weather, and of course we've got that long daylight in the middle of summer, so we can go ashore at any time if that's what is deemed the best thing to do to give people the best experience. And then we come back to the luxurious sky ships such as the Island Sky. So we're operating from this wonderful comfort level on board, so nice and luxurious, very comfortable, and then we go off for our big adventures.
Yeah. So I'm sure, just like you, when you're traveling in all the other parts of the world, conversations come up about, where they ask you, where would you like to go? And, among my big favorites, apart from the Indian Ocean, is always Antarctic. So it sort of comes up at the dinner table quite often with guests around the world. But the main trepidation I think people have about Antarctica, they ask about, is two things: the cold and the seasickness. And they're worried, or their partner, the husband or wife doesn't like the cold, or they're, worried about being seasick. So you want to talk a little bit to that?
Oh, yeah, well, certainly. Well, most of the Antarctic tourism goes from the most southern gateway port of
I'm going to bring up the map there, hey, Jane.
Excellent. That'll show the sea passages too, Pam. And so when people do think about booking, or even on their way to the ship, once they've made the commitment to this once-in-a-lifetime voyage, we leave from the southernmost part of South America, the port of Ushuaia, and it is actually the most southerly point in the southern hemisphere. Other places you can get to Antarctic from are a lot further north. So the sea crossings are relatively short given the size of the Southern Ocean, which is the circumpolar ocean that is all the way around the Antarctic continent with nothing stopping it, no land stopping it. So once we do leave the port of Ushuaia, we head to the Falklands. That's a one-day crossing. And that usually, because we're heading generally in an easterly direction, the weather's behind us. The prevailing conditions come from the west, and the swell can be anything from a few feet to 30 or 40 feet. Generally, it's about 10 to 12 feet. So if it is behind us, you tend not to feel the effects. But before you actually experience this, I think it's the trepidation and the anticipation that sometimes worries people a little bit, as you say.
Yeah.
So preparation for seasickness, you can certainly talk to your doctor. You can talk to other people who have maybe done this voyage. They can give you some sense of what it's all about. And then, of course, your crew and your staff will look after you. Often people do get a little bit seasick, usually nothing terribly dramatic. And within 24 hours, people have usually found their sea legs. So
yeah.
I think the real advice is to just brave your fear a little bit and realize it's probably going to be no problem at all, like most people who go to Antarctica. Also, once you do get through the sea crossing, wherever we land or go ashore, you are in the lee and the protection of many islands and landforms. So it means that actually where we're at the places that you want to be nice and healthy and feeling good, you usually not experience any seasickness whatsoever. So it's really just for those ocean crossings.
And
Once
so Jane, this next big crossing here over to South Georgia, that's one of the bigger crossings. And as you said, it's kind of still sort of with the prevailing weather. But this crossing is a very big, exciting part of the journey because of the Antarctic convergence. So it's not like one of those tropical crossings where sometimes you see absolutely nothing for 2 days. These are very, very lively, ocean-rich and wildlife-rich crossings.
Oh, very much so. And you're exactly right, Pam. From the Falklands to the South Georgia, you cross this magical biological line called the convergence, which is where the colder water from Antarctica mixes with the temperate water further north in the Atlantic. And that's where the productivity is, especially with the longer daylight hours. There's lots of phytoplankton and zooplankton. And of course, that's why all the wildlife flocks there in the summertime to take advantage of this productivity. So again, going from west to east means it is still generally behind you if the weather's coming from the west, which that is the prevailing condition, but you are a bit more exposed. I think you can see you're a bit more open to that gap between the Antarctic Peninsula being the northernmost point on Antarctica and the southernmost part of South America. So you're a bit more exposed, you feel more swell, and usually you would definitely feel the effects if you haven't already from Ushuaia to Stanley.
Yeah. And Jane, I don't know about you, but in the seasons that I've worked down there, it's not always so pronounced, but sometimes crossing the convergence is really, really dramatic and quite exciting. We've had times where you literally, as that sea temperature is dropping, you hit this fog bank and you're just sailing through. It feels like you're going into another world. Other times, especially when it's calm, you can sort of see this big current line in the water. But either which way, once you cross over that line, you feel it's colder. You're going to start to maybe be looking out for icebergs, and all the wildlife's going to change. So it's such an exciting part of the journey, certainly. Now, this next crossing is, I would say, one of the harder ones where you're slightly going into the prevailing weather, but you've got to do it to get down into the peninsula.
Exactly. And again, as you say, you've suddenly come into Antarctic waters. So that means you're starting to see more Antarctic wildlife. So it is all part of the adventure, and it really gives you a sense of what the Southern Ocean's all about. And again, you just go with it. You know you're in good hands. If you need the doctor's there for good advice. But by the time you get to this last crossing, most people have found their sea legs. So usually people are pretty comfortable. They know what to expect, and of course we'll always give them weather updates, and captain will also update if there is any patch of rough weather that we have to cross. So yes, it's all part of it, but it really gives you some appreciation of what Antarctica and the subantarctic's all about. In fact, if you don't experience this, I don't really think you get the real feel for the wildlife and the environment that that is out there in the Southern Ocean and subantarctic.
Yeah. And Jane, we can never complain too much when we do this particular crossing from South Georgia over to Elephant Island, because of course that's the journey that Shackleton and his men did in an open, basically rowing type of sailing boat. So we always feel a little bit more privileged that we get to do it on a lovely ship. But speaking of that, we do call this voyage the Wake of Shackleton sometimes, and that is because it ties so closely into the incredible voyages that Shackleton did just more than 100 years ago today now. So it's well worth in people's pre-reading before they come to the trip. Obviously, our lecturers are going to talk about it on board as well, but it is well worth getting hold of one of the many wonderful novels of the Shackleton journey for our particular voyages down here.
Oh, very much so, Pam. And that's the history of Antarctic exploration. It's relatively young. It was the heroic era that you're talking about, which is just over 100 years ago, with Scott, Mawson, Shackleton, and of course Shackleton's epic voyage, where he didn't lose one expedition member over that extended period, where some of his men were camped on Elephant Island. And as you say, they made the voyage the other direction than we do, so at least the weather was pushing them, but nevertheless in big seas in an open lifeboat essentially, and then they had to walk across South Georgia to the whaling station of Stromness, where they then managed to get their first stage of help. But it wasn't for several months later, until a few months later, that they actually could charter a vessel from Punta Arenas to go back to Elephant Island. So it's an incredible story of survival in the world's most harshest environment. So definitely worth a bit of pre-reading. It does give you some sense of what it's all about. In fact, reading such a novel while you're on this route even gives you more, or you almost feel like you're reliving it, but of course from the very comfortable and luxurious platform of our lovely little expedition vessels.
Jane, I was well impressed by your on-tap little history blurb there.
Yeah, there we go.
Not obviously heard the story enough times.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so now Jane, we're going to have totally different viewpoints on this next one. I know that because you come from the Canadian Rockies and I come from the tropics. The cold. All right, so come on, tell us what you think about the cold and I'll tell you what I think.
Well, one thing I've always been impressed by with British passengers, they understand weather. So if you think about the Falkland Islands, something like the Shetlands and the Orkneys, in maybe a spring or an autumn day, you've got wild winds, often rain, sometimes sunshine, but reasonable temperatures. Once you get to South Georgia, you're south of that convergence, so therefore the currents are cold. You really do feel, even as you go down to the most southern point of South Georgia, it gets colder and colder and colder. Again, the wind is the real problem in South Georgia, because of course the wind gives you some sort of wind chill factor. So you do have to come prepared with layers. So you've got a warm layer underneath and then a mid-warm layer. We provide you with nice big polar jackets and boots that you can use in our, more often than not, wet landings out of the Zodiacs. But you do need a good warm hat, gloves, warm socks, all those things that you know you can take on or off depending on what the conditions are like, and the wind will definitely make it feel colder. And if we are Zodiac cruising, that also feels a bit cold as well. Once you get to the peninsula, the temperatures can actually be colder, but there tends to be less wind in the protection of the mountains, so you find sometimes even a sunny day you can feel quite warm. So layers are the key to it. If you expect temperatures somewhere between -6 and about 6 degrees and a bit of a wind chill factor, you'll be able to prepare yourself very well, especially if you're from the northern part of the United Kingdom. That'll make a lot of sense.
Jane, it's funny you say that, because I sometimes wear almost the same gear in Antarctic as I would in Scotland on some of those days in Scotland. I really feel the cold. I don't like it. I hate the cold. I really, really suffer from the cold. But we give out, like Jane said, really great boots and really great parkas, and then it's just up to people. You know, you got to have the waterproof pants and to do your mid layers. So I wear a really thick. Jane wears like a cap and, you know, sandals half the time. I wear like the thickest puffy jacket that you can get. But if you've got good gear, one good mid layer, then you can kind of dress like a normal human underneath all those, underneath your shell and your mid layer. So it actually, it's very doable. And I think you said no such thing as bad weather, just bad equipment. So it's taken me years to get my gear right, but it's definitely possible to be very, very comfortable, even in spite of the strong conditions there. So I'm going to jump over now to some of the images, because I wanted to ask you, in terms of when you say to people why to go to Antarctic, what is the thing? You know what I mean? Why is it one of your favorite? Why do you always stick your hand out and leap for the chance to go and work down in Antarctica? What is it there that's different or better or unique that makes it for you?
Well, I think it's the combination of the inaccessibility, the wilderness, the spectacular scenery, the icebergs, the sea ice, and the wildlife. In summer, it's a haven for wildlife because of the productive waters with the long daylight hours. And then, of course, they all have to come ashore at some stage to breed. So you see this incredible diversity ashore of these marine wildlife that you would maybe not see so easily out in the Southern Ocean. So you see this incredible density of seabird colonies, like the various penguins. You get to see several species of penguins all going well. You get to see several species of seals and whales, and it is amazing. It's the biodiversity as well as the actual concentrations of the wildlife. And you've got lots of interesting images up there, Pam. They're great shots. I presume that they look like they're many of yours from a typical trip. So it's good to see, you know, what a typical photograph looks like, because we can all, luckily we get lots of experience down there and we can always pull out that shot from a nice sunny day. But this is reality, which is pretty good really when you think you've got icebergs there, you've got fur seals. Look at those king penguins, absolutely magnificent. This is a lot of South Georgia photos. Salisbury Plain, a great place we can land. Of course, everything's weather permitting, but we've got lots of tricks up our sleeve. If we've got bad weather in one spot, we often...
Wait, so Jane, did you know these were my photos? You realized they were lousy and you're like, oh, these must be your photos.
yeah, no, not at all, Pam. But you know, this would be a typical folder of photos from a typical Antarctic, sub-Antarctic voyage. Don't you agree?
Yeah,
so
no, exactly. Yeah, these are just a random bunch that I've taken over the years. You know, there's so few places in the world where you can get large concentrations of large wildlife. Obviously, I come from South Africa. We're used to being able to go to these game reserves and see big game in big numbers. But then you go around the rest of the world and there's very few places where you can see that. To a degree, up in Alaska, you can get this sort of big wildlife, big numbers in Russian Far East. But outside of that, South Georgia is one of those special places, big wildlife in big concentrations, and it's so immersive. The sounds, the smell, the feeling of the wind on your cheek, so that chill factor, it so takes you out of your, completely into an entire different universe. And I sometimes find that those crossings help you to break away from the world you came from. So, you know, the first few days of a voyage, sometimes when people snap straight into a voyage, they're still worrying if they set things up properly with their housekeeper or whatever, you know, did I leave the geyser on, blah, blah, blah. And it sometimes takes that 2 days of sea crossing or day of sea crossing, which you always get on these Antarctic voyages, to snap out of where you came from and start zooming in and focusing onto where you're going. And then when you are there, I find like you're so much more immersed. And one thing I always try and put words to how it really touches people. It's hard to explain, but it's that big white wilderness. It's the no sense of scale. It's the no trees, no houses, no people, just you, the big weather, the big wildlife, the big icebergs, the big mountains, and this big white wilderness. And it changes people. Always on that last straight crossing back home, people are also having time to download their memories of the things they just saw and did before they have to start thinking about home again. And I think those crossings in a way really help to people make it more special, and they get more immersed in this incredible nature experience.
Oh, very much so, Pam. And I always go back to my first experiences with being a scientist on Macquarie Island. We had to climb down a rope ladder, jump in a zodiac, land in big surf, and I'll never forget my first impressions. It just blew me away, and I try to keep that in the front of my mind when I'm an expedition leader, so that I can manage things in a way that, as you say, people step through the experience rather than it being overload, because it can be overload. But if you enjoy the crossings and see the seabirds, and then suddenly realize you're coming into the place where they nest after seeing the place that they feed. And then last year, for example, our first activity was a zodiac cruise, so that everyone could get the sense of how extraordinary South Georgia was before we actually stepped ashore, because it is mind-blowing, as they say, and it's overwhelming at times. So you're exactly right. Each landing has a different lot of experiences, and it's a lot to digest. And on that trip home, you do find people are quite contemplative and reflective, and it does change people. It inspires people, and of course, I think that's part of why we're all doing what we do, is because it is such an incredible place. We want it protected. And of course, Noble Caledonia is very good with their charitable trust, trying to support some of the conservation efforts in places like this, in particular, the sub-Antarctic island of South Georgia. So yes, it's definitely, I would say, the #1 expedition cruise. I mean, they're all wonderful and all different all around the world, but this is the best way to get to this part of the world, and it's the experience that is the most remote, where we generally come across no other people. So you're right, total immersion.
Yeah, and you tapped on it there, and it's so true. It's the privilege to be able to go to these places comes with, once you go, this sense of duty or responsibility or inspiration to protect these places. And so, in a sense, when we take people to these wild and wonderful places, we all in parts become ambassadors for those places. For, if it's Madagascar or the South Pacific, you feel more invested in the outcome for those places. But nothing touches people, I think, quite as much as Antarctic. And people do, in a sense, become ambassadors for the preservation of wilderness in general, and Antarctic especially. So that is a kind of a nice end off, I think, for these sorts of voyages.
Oh, very much so. And when you think about Noble Caledonia's voyages, they've got the perfect combination, because they're including Falklands and the South Georgia and the Antarctic Peninsula. Even though it's quite a long voyage, it's a relatively compact voyage to see that incredible diversity of all of those different habitats. So it really is something special, and I really like the way Noble Caledonia have set it up, especially with the small number of guests on our lovely little ships.
Yeah, well, Jane, because we do similar roles, I don't know how often we will get to do the Antarctic together, but I'm sure I speak for both of us when I say I hope we can have many of the familiar guests that we've dealt with so many times that have been umming and ahhing about Antarctic, that we'll see them down there one of these days, because it is truly the quintessential expedition adventure, and something we hope to share with you in the future.
Yes, and our wonderful flexible approach means that we'll give you absolutely everything we can, given the daylight hours and the wildlife and the weather. So we'll maximise whatever comes our way in terms of the unpredictable. We'll make sure we maximise that for people and do our best to make it a once-in-a-lifetime voyage, because it really is something special, and we really want people to take advantage of being in such a remote area. So definitely Noble Caledonia is one of the older member companies of IATO. They've really got expedition cruising down pat. They know how to work it properly to really give guests an extraordinary experience. And of course, if there are any concerns or apprehensions, the sales team are always there to answer questions. And if they're not quite sure of the answers, they know where to find Pam and I. So we would love to do our best to try and help people understand what they're going into and make sure they have an extraordinary voyage.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Is there anything else you wanted to add? I think it pretty much, you just said it perfectly right there.
Oh, absolutely. I think one thing that we perhaps have underplayed a little bit, Pam, is as expedition leaders, of course, we're only as good as our team, and we've got extraordinary expedition teams. Like the team we had on the Antarctic trip last year, there was such an incredible mix, like best in the business Zodiac drivers who can handle the rougher conditions to make it safe for our guests. If you haven't got that, you can't get people ashore. Then we've got all these experts, some like myself and Chris, who've got Antarctic science experience, and we can give you that side of what Antarctic is all about. And then all of our experts, whether it's marine mammals or photographers, and they're all there to enhance that experience for you. And that really is the icing on the cake for such a fantastic destination.
That's so true, Jane. Yeah, and thanks for actually bringing it up. I often also think, you know, Antarctic doesn't depend on the landings themselves or getting off the ship themselves. The whole experience is so extraordinary, even as seen from the ship, and that's a lot of it is brought alive by some of our expert lecturers and wonderful expedition teams. You know, the content that we have on board, but the stuff that you can just see from the ship, even if you don't achieve landings, and if the weather gets in the way, the weather is part of the adventure as well. So it almost sells itself. It's a challenging area to operate, but it's also sort of sells itself. Like, you can't be disappointed with what you're going to see and do, even if you get stuck on the ship for days for the weather. That is such an exciting event in itself, you know.
And as you say, Pam, some things are best seen from the ship, like some of the bigger whales that we might see, humpbacks being the most common. Sometimes the ship is the best platform, especially if the captain's willing to open up the bow. It all becomes part of the adventure. And because we're all in this together and relatively remote from being at home or interacting with other people, the atmosphere on board is really one of excitement, adventure and camaraderie. So, you know, it really is something special in that respect.
Yeah. Nice, Jane. Well, Jane, thanks so much for your time and getting to chat with us about Antarctic. I think that's a really nice way to introduce it to people.
My pleasure, Pam. It's fun to talk about it, and it is a pity now that we're both expedition leaders, we don't get to sail together anymore. But anyway,
yeah.
we get to do fun things like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, Jane, thank you so much. I'm sure we'll have another chat or two with Jane over the course of weeks to come about some of the other areas that she loves to share. So thank you for your time, Jane, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Will do. You too, Pam.
Okay, bye.
Bye.